welcome. This afternoon, I am really proud and feeling very, very happy to introduce Dr. Brian Boyd. He's a professor and director of the Juniper Gardens Children's Project at the University of Kansas. As the director of a community-based applied research center focused on child development, he has been heavily engaged in research that involves the most vulnerable and often marginalized populations. As a special educator by training, much of his research has involved the development and evaluation of evidence-based practices that could be implemented within school-based contexts. His more recent work has focused on how issues of implicit bias and race affect the outcomes of children with and without autism. Dr. Boyd's research has been continuously funded by the Institute of Education Sciences and National Institutes of Health. Currently, he serves as the vice president of the International Society for Autism Research and co-editor of the Journal of Early Intervention. He also serves on multiple national boards that are dedicated to improving the outcomes. On a personal note, Dr. Boyd has been excellent in conveying his message at the Autism Science Affection Day, the Convention Day of Learning, which I attended along with Priscilla. He has a wonderful message, and I want to say welcome, Dr. Boyd.
Thank you. Thanks, Robin. Happy to be here today. Thanks for inviting me to the academic festival and have me present as part of this. We can keep this pretty informal, but let me see if I can do step one correctly and successfully share my screen. All right, so let's see. Second screen there. Let's try it again here. All right, so are you seeing the right view or not?
Nope, I'm seeing your view.
So are we good now?
Yep, perfect.
Awesome. Okay, just let me know if it messes up and I can switch again. All right, so again, we can keep it informal. People can feel free to chime in and ask me questions. I think there's a Q&A period at the end. But I'm happy to talk to you about this topic. My guess is being college professors and being at universities, you're seeing a lot more students who identify as neurodiverse in some way or autistic in some way. And we all know that we all have multiple identities that make us up. And so how does that shape one's college experience when part of your identity is being autistic or being neurodiverse in some way? And so I'm just going to talk through some of these issues, put it within a larger context, though, of sort of thinking about minoritized groups in general. And so how this is essentially another way of being a minoritized group, a member of a minoritized group. And so how do we think about these things with college-age students? So I'm going to put it in a broader societal context, but in addition to sort of drilling down onto the specific issue of being autistic or neurodiverse in college. All right, having cursor issues here. Sorry, get this straight here. All right, so all right, presentation overview. Hopefully I can get it correct here. Again, I'm going to talk a little bit about issues of autism and neurodiversity, sort of define those terms for folks who may be less familiar with them. Talk about these larger issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, access, all the words that go together, social justice to some degree, but how those issues are relevant to understanding autism or being neurodiverse. Then I think as you probably heard from Robin in my introduction, a lot of my early work has been on young children with autism. And so I've only recently started working with adolescents and older adults and adults with autism. So this is sort of new for me. So I think it's more interesting to hear from autistic individuals and caregivers about their perspective on being college students or having a child in college, and what was some of their lessons learned. So I'm going to play some audio clips from stakeholders so you can get their firsthand experiences on these issues, and then hopefully we have an opportunity to dialogue around what your experiences are. Sorry about this. I don't know what is happening with my cursor, so apologies. So let me just start by saying all of us, right, have multiple intersecting identities and roles that they play that shape who we are, that shape our experiences of the world. And some of these identities we see as more core to ourselves than others. A larger part, a more tangible part of who we are. And so for me, being a Black male, being gay, all these things are part of a big part of my identity. But some of these things are, some of these core parts of my identity, like being a professor and a researcher, also a big part of me, but they aren't salient to others unless I share those experiences, right? Unless I tell people that I'm a professor. But all of these parts of me make up my experiences, right? They make up how I interact with others, how I interact with the world. They affect those things. And so I think it's helpful to know who I am and where I'm coming from. So I'm also part of a minoritized group in America. I'm not autistic, I'm not neurodiverse, but I can understand or at least empathize with the experiences of those who are in a different way. And I think you can think for yourselves, what are the identities and roles that make up who you are, that shape your interactions with the world, and how you may sort of interpret and understand the experiences of those who are autistic or neurodiverse. All right, I think my cursor is behaving better now. So let's start with defining a little bit around autism and neurodiversity. So neurodiversity is really this umbrella term to some degree that talks about that essentially another way we are diverse as individuals is diversity of the human mind, right? That it's really referring to sort of neurological or brain-based differences that may affect input and output, that may affect the way we understand information and receive information, but also may affect the way we express information. And so a variety of conditions really fall under this umbrella. So autistic, ADHD, dyslexia, OCD, depression. So really conditions that affect sort of the human brain to some degree. So it's really just another form of diversity. All right, so there are these essential principles, if you will, of neurodiversity. One, as I said, that it's essentially just another form of human diversity. It's another way in which we're diverse. So obviously it could be racially, ethnically diverse, linguistically diverse. So we could also be neurodiverse. Um, and that this idea of what is a normal, quote unquote, normal functioning brain, right, is really socioculturally defined or dependent, just like race is a sociocultural construct, right? So this is what neurodiverse people are saying, is that the idea that there's one way to have a normal brain or to be neurocognitively intact is really socioculturally defined. I mean, there are various ways in which we can be diverse, but obviously being neurodiverse affects interactions, right? And can and it affects social dynamics but in a different way than may be affected by racial ethnic diversity or gender diversity. And so there's various terminology. I won't go into all of these. I'm happy to share some slides that folks have used. Neurodiverse really refers to a group of individuals. And so people who think of themselves as neurodiverse are neurodivergent in some way, and those of us who aren't neurodiverse, we're called neurotypicals, we're referred to as neurotypicals. And so again, it's another way in which one can be a minority, in this case, a neuro minority. But the neurodiversity movement itself, like civil rights movements, like disability rights movements, they really see rooted in a social justice framework, right? It's another way in which we should strive for equality and access and full inclusion of all people, including those who are neurodiverse. So, a little bit about autism. So, we thought about the broader context of framework of neurodiversity. Let's think a little bit more specifically about autism, which is one form of neurodiversity. Again, there are multiple ways in which one can be neurodiverse. Autism is one way. So, for those who don't know, maybe less familiar, so what's said about autism in terms of a textbook definition of autism, if you will? So one, it's a lifelong disability. There is no cure. I think autistic individuals would say there's no need for a cure. People certainly can improve over time, and some can look quite neurotypical, but it is a lifelong developmental disability. The current prevalence is that 1 in 44 children, or about 2% of the population, are autistic. We identify more males than females with autism. And it sort of results in qualitative differences in social communication and interactions. We also see more what are called repetitive behaviors or sensory issues around autistic individuals. So the way they process information in the sensory information in the environment. So sounds, sights, smells, and sort of the behaviors that and then they may have behaviors as a result of having to deal with the sensory overload from their environment. And there are lots of individual differences. Folks are very different in the level of severity of their autism, so the degree to which they are somehow impaired by their autism, that it actually functions as a disability for them. They're very different levels in terms of their ability to complete daily living skills and function in daily life and live independent lives. Very different in IQ levels, all the way from very low IQs to IQs that move people into the savant territory. So very broad spectrum. It's really referred to as a spectrum condition for autistic individuals. And so what's not been said, what don't you often see in the textbooks? So one, many autistic individuals consider autism as core, as part of their identity in a way in which they are neurodiverse. And they really encourage us to use identity first language instead of person first language. To say an autistic individual versus an individual with autism. Because again, they see it as an essential part of, a major part of a very salient part of their identity. We also know that autism affects all racial ethnic groups and all income levels. So again, we will think about those issues of intersectionality, given that we do see it across groups of people. Even though we currently have more males being diagnosed, there's lots of issues around, we think, under-identification of females. Again, that could be part sociocultural, that we think of autism as a male disorder. So we may have more trouble diagnosing it in females. And then other things, historically, autism was really considered or thought of as a white middle-class disorder. And I think that contributes to some of the biases we still see in terms of diagnosis of kids. So autism in young adulthood, which is the age at which you're seeing a lot of these individuals. So in general, I think the first point is that we don't know enough about aging with autism. And there's so much more to learn. We forget that kids grow up and autistic kids grow up. And so we need to learn more about aging with autism. We do know that adolescence and young adulthood is a big time in general, we know, right, for mental health conditions, but we really see this in autism. There are really high rates of depression and anxiety in particular, way higher than we find in the general population. So you are likely seeing some kids who have co-occurring mental health conditions, as well. This is also a time, right, that they're coming to terms a lot of times with their own identity of being autistic or neurodiverse. And so that can contribute to some of these issues most likely. We also know that after high school, that a lot of these kids have trouble finding the needed services and supports because now they're outside of the special education system. And a lot of our systems in this country were really set up based on sort of legacy systems. The mental health system doesn't really interact with the disability system. And most of the services for folks with disabilities really have this sort of IQ threshold. Essentially, you have to have a co-occurring intellectual disability to get access to a lot of needed services. So a lot of the folks who end up in college who have the IQ to be able to go to college sort of fall through this crack of what's called the services cliff. They're off a services cliff and they experience a service gap because they don't qualify for some disability services because they have sort of intact IQs, but they also, a lot of times they can't qualify for mental health services because folks who provide mental health services attribute everything to autism. They don't think that you can be autistic and have depression, or you can be autistic and have an anxiety disorder. And so you may need mental health services. So there's really can be a gap for these folks. And then I'm going to talk more about these issues of intersectionality. We do see it. We do see that racial minorities who are also autistic, that we see disparities in outcomes related to that particular group. So when we're thinking about issues of inclusion and access for all, we certainly see these things play out within the context of autism as well. So let's talk about autism now and diversity, equity, inclusion, and access and those kinds of issues before we come back to being autistic and a college student, just to provide a broader context for some of these issues. And this is what I presented on that Robin was talking about at the Autism Science Foundation last year. So the first thing to know is that we do see racial and ethnic disparities in autism. And that while the overall prevalence in terms of 1 in 44 children having autism is similar, we do see disparities in delayed or misdiagnoses for Black children. We continue to see under-identification of autism in Latino children. And so we do see these various disparities. We also see disparities in access to services, that fewer and lower quality services, Black and brown families in particular, indigenous families, poor families from lower income households are more likely to experience service desert, so they have to travel farther to get their kids access to the services they need. Those families are also the ones, in particular, families from lower resourced households are more likely to have kids to experience those service cliffs, so not being able to access any services after they get out of high school. So there are varying ways in which disparity plays itself out in autism as well. And we're seeing some differences in characteristics of autism. So Latino children, for some reason, seem to have some more severe presentations of autism sometimes, and that could be related to underdiagnosis and not getting the right services at the right time in their lives that they need. We're finding that Black kids are twice as likely to have a co-occurring intellectual disability, so to have a lower IQ, and we don't know why. Again, it could be issues related to not getting the services they need because they're getting delayed diagnoses at the right time in their lives. So really, this is just to provide some context for these issues of intersectionality and how they're playing out in autism, specific to autism. Right, but as we know, as likely a lot of you know, in the US, there is a big intersection of race and class, and these are pre-pandemic numbers. I don't know what the poverty numbers are currently in the US because we know the pandemic exacerbated disparity, exacerbated some of these issues, and forced some more families into poverty. But 60% of Native American, Black and Latinx children live in lower income households compared to 30% of white and Asian children. And the way this is talked about in research is really, it's talked about as concentrated or compounded disadvantage. So if you're low-income racial minorities, right, are more likely to live and attend lower resource schools, right? And so if you attend to lower resource schools, you're not getting access to the same quality of education. We know low-income racial minorities are also more likely to live in racially segregated neighborhoods, usually racially segregated neighborhoods that don't have access to the same kinds of resources that more inclusive neighborhoods have access to. So they have to travel further for things. So food deserts, community, sort of community centers for their children, all kinds of resources and capital that living in a higher income neighborhood affords you. And so we see compounded or concentrated disadvantage as a result of these issues. So imagine added on to this, having a disability, your child being autistic and as well, and then attending a lower resource school, having to then travel further to get your child access to the needed services, also living in poverty. So you can see how this compounds disadvantage in many ways. And so again, as we're saying, these issues of identity, as I started out describing who I am, Black male, professor, Southerner, all these kinds of things, we can't dissect or divorce these different parts of our identity. And there are multiple ways in which we can be minoritized or considered a minority. For me, it's being Black and a gay man. These are multiple minoritizing identities. And so for autistic people, it's having a disability. But then if you add on to that being a racial ethnic minority with disability, we also know within the autistic community that there's a higher number who identify as being LGBTQ plus in some way than we find in the general population, or just being non-binary, gender non-binary in some way. So we see more gender fluidity in autism. So there's multiple ways in which you can be a minority, but multiple minoritizing identities we know can affect outcomes. And so I'm just going to play a quick video here from a parent who has a son with autism, just to give her perspective on these issues of being, having multiple minoritizing identities. I'm going to drink some water because I can't talk right now.
I could start with, what does it mean to be a Black mother, period? So for us as parents, there is always an anxiety. I like to say that the feelings, the memory, and the spirit of historical trauma and the story of Emmett Till just lies within our womb, within our soul in the Black community. The fear of a Black mother. I mean, I always say Black folks are not allowed to be unapologetically themselves. They are not permitted to be neurodiverse. And we know this on a lot of levels. So my biggest fear is if an officer approaches my child and my child begins to stem, have to put his hands in his pocket to take out one of the little things he likes to hold on to help him with his anxiety. He's got one of his little trinkets or things that he holds on to and reaches into that pocket to pull it out to calm himself. What's going to happen to my son?
And so I think it's a great example of multiple minoritizing identities, right? So for her, it's not just that her son is autistic that's quite salient, it's that her son is also a Black man, and his potential interactions with the police in this country and how that could impact him. And so, again, her son is an adolescent, where we're thinking about college-age students and their experiences that they're having and how being autistic can't be divorced from the other ways in which they may be a minority, or considered a minority, I should say. Again, just some more quick things. We know, right, that there are larger societal forces that are at play here that impact disparity and that we're thinking about in autism, some related to systemic racism that contribute to wealth inequality and residential segregation, just overall unequal resource allocation society. And there are also implicit racial biases, and I'm going to talk a little bit about implicit racial biases and how they play themselves out in autism. So again, just defining some terms, I won't go through the whole slide, but in general, implicit biases, right, are really just mental associations. They're involuntary, unconscious thoughts that attribute in terms of how we associate certain social groups, so being Black, with stereotypic attributes in society. And they're really, right, because all of us have implicit biases because we live in a socially stratified society. We live in certain neighborhoods. We are more exposed to certain people more often. So we all carry biases in various ways. The important thing about implicit biases in comparison to more explicit prejudices or overt racism is that it's not related to education level. Everyone has implicit biases. We see similar levels of implicit biases among judges and doctors and teachers as we do amongst those with less formal education. So we all have them we all have them and carry them with us. But the other important thing to know is that implicit biases have been associated or correlated from a research perspective with actual behavioral performance. So they've been associated with implicit racial biases have been associated with white people having less friendly interactions with Black conversational partners. We see within the research literature on how doctors interact with racial minority patients that those who have higher levels of implicit bias are less likely to ask minority patients questions and have a more dominant style of interacting with them, or provide different treatment recommendations to minority patients than non-minority patients, non-racial minority patients. It has been associated with biasing among jurors and judges, biased sentencing, and discriminatory practices within the job market, hiring practices within the job market. The other thing we know is that when if you aggregate implicit bias data, so if you look at it at the level of a county, of a state, you even find stronger associations or higher or larger correlations. So it's also been associated with more cardiovascular disease. So in counties or states in which there are more implicit racial biases, you see more health disparities in terms of cardiovascular disease. You see more disparities in terms of infant health outcomes, more disparities in upward mobility, more Google searches for racial slurs, more residential segregation, more school segregation. So it impacts sort of larger societal contexts. And so how does this apply to autism? I'll just give you one study. I have to do some studies and research because I am a professor. Can't help it. But there was a study done by another group, I was not involved in this, where they really surveyed college students. My guess is these are psychology students because I remember taking a lot of undergraduate surveys when I was an undergrad psych student. And they had them both complete the implicit association test, which is a computerized test you can take online. And they had these same students read vignettes that sort of randomly assigned to them, either describing an autistic child or a child with a conduct disorder. And those vignettes were also randomly paired with either a photo of a Black child or a photo of a white child. And what they found were within group racial biases. So white college students were more likely to associate autism with white children and conduct disorder with Black children. And they found the opposite for Black college students. And I think this matters to autism because most of our diagnosticians and clinicians are white. And so if there's this automatic preference, this automatic associations amongst white individuals who are doing more of the diagnoses that autism is a white disorder, then that may affect sort of their diagnoses, right? And how we see and perceive autism. And I will talk a little bit more about this, but I think it's sort of bringing these issues together around race, implicit biases, the broader issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, and how they may impact individuals who are autistic or neurodiverse. And then one more study, because as I said, we know there's a higher prevalence of being LGBTQ and being autistic. So we looked at some of these issues in a survey of 18 to 64-year-olds of autistic individuals, some who identified, 62 who identified as LGBTQ, 58 who identified as cisgender, and we looked at differences in their self-reported health outcomes. Again, this is just to show how intersectionality affects outcomes and why we should be thinking about these issues. So I won't get into the sample that much. I'm happy to answer questions about it. So, but the first question compared the two groups on some issues. And what we found was that those who were autistic and LGBTQ reported that they had more unmet healthcare needs than those who were cisgender. So again, both groups were autistic, but one group was also LGBTQ, so they were having harder time finding a doctor and getting their healthcare needs met. So again, being a college student, being autistic, but also being gay, like adding those things together and how that may affect the services and supports people feel they need and their ability to get access to the services and supports they really need in order to thrive and be successful in that environment. The other question, we just looked at just the group who identified as autistic and LGBTQ. And we looked at what predicted outcomes. So what led to more unmet healthcare needs? Was it race, ethnicity? Was it income? Was it that they lived in the rural or urban area? Or was it that they lived in a state, this is a nationally represented survey, a state in which there was not a law that specifically prohibited discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity. And what we found to understand how larger societal issues affect these things is that the only predictor of individuals who are LGBTQ and autistic in terms of the only predictor of those who had more unmet healthcare needs was if they lived in the state that where the laws did not specifically prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity. So that shows how broader issues of society, systems in place sort of also can impact and affect outcome. So some of these things can't just be addressed at the level of the individual because they're systemic and they're baked to how we operate as a society. So let's get back to tying these issues together and being autistic in college. And so most of this remaining section here is really the voices of stakeholders. And I'm gonna say I screwed up the Zoom recording. These were supposed to be Zoom videos of Zoom interviews, but you're just gonna hear audio from these folks because when I went back and looked at the Zoom recording, it was just a photo of me and you didn't actually get to see Linda or Spencer. So Linda is a parent of an autistic college student. Well, now her son Joey is out of college. He graduated, but he started in community college, transferred to a four-year college, and graduated, I do believe, with dual degrees in biology and computer science. But Linda is also a clinician. She actually also works to support college-aged autistic students who actually go off to community college. It's a program that she helps work them through. She works for the North Carolina Teach program. So she has experiences both as a parent, but also she works in this realm. Spencer is autistic. He also went to community college. I think Spencer told me he graduated in 2005, but now he's also currently a college student because he's decided to pursue a bachelor's degree actually in psychology. So he has both prior experiences, but also current experiences as a college student. So we're going to start with just hearing from Spencer, talking about some of what affects his college experiences, or what he thinks affects the college experiences, I should say, of autistic individuals in general, not just his.
I think one of the most pressing issues for me is dealing with disclosure, because you don't know what that professor or administrator is going to think about your diagnosis. It's one thing when you go to the Disability Services Office. There is much more of an understanding that having a disability, there is protections in place. There's legislation. There are laws that guard that disclosure. But if you have professors or administrators that are not bound by that in certain circumstances, such as if you talk about your disability in class, that kind of creates a different wrinkle. And you don't know how people are going to react. You don't know what myths they're going to believe. You don't know what they're not going to agree with or concur with when it comes to certain questions you may have or requests you may have. You know, you can be autistic and be in the class, but there are sometimes assumptions that because you can talk, that somehow you're not autistic. That if you are a woman, you're not autistic. If you are Black, that you're not autistic. These are things that unfortunately still do persist. It's something that I've struggled to really believe. I'm like, this can't be happening. It's 2022. Surely there's an understanding that autism does not correspond only to cisgender, straight, white male children, but that still seems to be a problem to this day.
So I think Spencer brings up a couple really important issues. One, autistic individuals struggle with this of disclosure. Who should they disclose to, and when is it important, and to talk about, to tell someone that they're autistic, and how will it affect reactions from professors and also fellow students, right? They know they have to disclose to Disability Services and Accessibility Office, but do you tell others? And part of the reluctance to tell others obviously is maybe stigma. They worry about stigma or discrimination they may face if they do tell. He also brought up, as I said, important issues of intersectionality that also have to be thought about in the larger
Circumstances.
So just for folks to know, there are some challenges that some autistic college students may face, some related to being autistic and characteristics of autism. So we know that autistic individuals have more issues with the executive functioning skills. So being able to organize and plan and deal with time management and those kinds of things can be a challenge. They may struggle with self-regulation and coping. So just being able to sometimes manage emotion, cope with not getting a perfect score on their test, those kinds of things, and just having coping skills. The sensory environment is often a big one for them. College classrooms are often full of students. There's lots going on. They're having to listen to the professor, but also, they hear their rumblings and their fellow students typing, and just dealing with the varying aspects of the sensory environment can sometimes be overwhelming for some individuals. As I talked about, mental health is a big issue. And then there's the social relationships, right? Making friends when social skills are a core sort of issue, core deficit, if you will, core characteristic of autism. So having to make friends in college can be hard. Those are the characteristic level, but there are also, as I said, larger issues of society and systemic issues that they face. Again, stigma and discrimination around having autism. And that can lead to some autistic individuals feeling the need to have to mask, to sort of pretend that they don't have autism, to sort of try to camouflage some of their characteristics or some parts of their core identity so folks don't know that they're autistic. But that's stressful. That's taxing for people to have to hide part of who they are and what makes them them. I mean, obviously, having a disability, you then can also be impacted by ableism and what people believe or perceive, the ability of folks, the abilities that those with disabilities have or don't have. There are also multiple ways in which one can have implicit biases. So you can have implicit racial biases, but there are also implicit biases people hold around folks with disabilities. And the other thing I talked about earlier, there are just limited supports and accommodations sometimes for autistic individuals, in particular autistic individuals in college. Apparently I never saw the cursor issue, but we'll keep going. So Linda's going to talk about a pretty unique challenge that her son Joey faced in college, and I think it's a great experience we can talk more about during the Q&A.
When he was taking chemistry, because it was one of those situations where he was asked to find a lab partner. And Joey not only has autism, but he has this severe language processing delay, which makes it very anxiety provoking to talk to people who don't know him, because he just can't get the words out, and people don't really wait for him to get his words out. So he
Whoa, I don't know what just happened. Yeah, something is going on with my screen and it got upset with me. Hmm.
You may have to click out and then click back in.
Okay. Is that me that's making that noise?
Yes, I don't hear anything on my end.
Okay, I'm hearing like a beeping noise. Jeez. It's not letting me put it back into presenter view, but are you seeing my slides at all, Priscilla?
Yes, we can see your slides.
Okay, I'm just gonna do this view and see if, because I just have like 3 or 4 slides left, and so okay,
Perfect.
that's it. If you guys would just see my notes, it'd be okay. Yeah. Is that not playing now though? I don't. So, are you guys hearing that? I'm getting a really.
No, I'm not hearing anything.
I'm getting a loud beeping sound.
We did see the slide though, Brian.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what's going on. I don't think I'm going to be able to play these clips for some reason. They stopped working, and I'm just getting some weird feedback related to them.
Okay.
So I'll just walk through the. Sorry. All right.
When he was
Never mind.
taking chemistry, because it was one of those situations where he was asked to find a lab partner. And Joey not only has autism, but he has this severe language processing delay, which makes it very anxiety provoking to talk to people who don't know him, because he just can't get the words out, and people don't really wait for him to get his words out. So I think it was really great what he did. He went to the teacher, which really surprised me because asking for help is really hard. And he told the teacher that he didn't know how to find a lab partner, that he wanted her to help him. And she said, well, I can't do that because you don't have that on your disability plan. And if I help you, I'll have to help everybody. And that's just not practical. So you're going to have to do something about, you'll have to take care of this. So he was again frustrated and came to me and said that he had to go to disability services. And so we made another appointment, went to disability services. I did go with him because it was not on the campus that he could get to on his own. And so they put it on his disability plan that in lab classes or classes where he needed to have a partner, someone would help him. So the teacher did, it all worked out, but it was not something that we anticipated ahead of time. So had we known about that, we could have maybe asked for it. But working with the community college was a little frustrating because they basically said, well, you have autism, so this is what you get. So there wasn't any kind of individualization until he had a problem.
So I think that's a helpful example there. And these are some supports that really, in my interview with Spencer and Linda, that they identified that would be helpful. So really more individualized career exploration. Linda said through her program, they also spend a lot of time helping students to prepare to go visit career services or the disability or accessibility office to know what to ask for. And some specific things that Spencer mentioned was assistance with note taking, assistance with time management, having more projects that can be done out of the classroom where they can really sort of do something over a semester or really think about how to manage time versus in-class quizzes. He's a big fan of hybrid classes and being able to do some things remotely because it can help with the sensory environment and sensory overload. And he also talked about having a modified sensory environment in some cases. And so, and just one more support, I'll let Spencer talk a little bit more about the other support he mentioned as well.
With college, I've learned, especially going back, things have changed quite a bit, and there are some good changes. But as far as being an autistic college student, I think a lot of the concerns are still relevant to your neurotypical college students. It's can I afford all of this? Can I afford the loans? What can I find for a job to help mitigate those costs? How can I find textbooks that aren't going to cost me, $2,000 a semester? Those sorts of things are kind of ubiquitous to college students in general. I do think that there are issues regarding how, especially when it comes to socialization on campus, that are changing for the better, especially right now with the use of social media. While Facebook does dominate the conversation, there has been a lot more in other forms, Snapchat, TikTok, even other ones that are not as ubiquitous like Discord. A lot of college students are more aware now of autistic students, are more aware of autism itself, and not in the traditional charity-focused way. They see it from the autistic perspective. We are here having our voices heard much more, and this is really, really important, and it's good. In one of my classes, I had students, I didn't even bring it up, but autism was brought in conversation. It was a social psychology class, and I had students that were talking about it and saying the same things that I've been saying for years, that we as autistics have been saying for years. And this was really, really incredible when you're hearing the things that you've been trying to say, like we're not a disease. There's more than just, cisgender, straight, white male children. A lot of us grow up and we do have families, and there are autistic parents out there. These are things that I did not hear when I went to college for the first time. So that has changed a lot, and I am very, very pleased to see that, especially with other students, because that matters a lot.
So one obvious support that Spencer's talking about is just the increased awareness and actual acceptance of autistic individuals. And that's a big support being in college right now, that this is a different generation of students who are just more aware of diversity in so many ways. And we see that with each new generation of students. And so that's a helpful support as well within college. So just some concluding remarks here quickly. As I said, there are more college students who now identify as neurodiverse and autistic, right? So we're just seeing, it's another form of diversity that we're just seeing more of in college students. But these issues of intersectionality do affect their lives and outcomes. We see disparities in various ways, and we see different outcomes in various ways based on issues of being a multiple, based on issues of having a multiple minoritizing identity. And that autistic students may face some unique challenges, like issues experiences with the sensory environment. But we know with the right supports and services that they can thrive in a college environment. Spencer is an example, and so is Linda's son. So I'm actually going to have Linda give us the last word here, and then we can engage in some Q&A. And I figured out what happened. Apparently my sound got stuck on high, and that was causing some of the issues apparently.
Years, and I still get surprised all the time by, you know, how they present, what they want to do, why they want to do it. And it's, you know, it's really important to remember that they're individuals and they all have different needs. And I think a lot of the community colleges are missing the boat by saying, oh, well, you have autism, so this must be your problem, and this is what we're going to do for you. Because nobody just has garden variety autism anymore. They all, you know, there's ADHD, there's OCD, there's anxiety and depression. You know, we've got kids who are bipolar. We've got a lot of kids with gender fluidity and gender dysphoria and gender questioning, you know, and so that's a whole big thing that's weighing them down. So I think the biggest takeaway I've had from working with these kids is you just can't assume anything. They're all very, very different.
I don't think there's a better way to end than that, and just reminding that they're all individuals and they'll all have different needs and supports that will be helpful to them in order to thrive in a college environment. So that was my presentation. Happy to engage in a Q&A, and apologies for all the technical issues there, but managed to get through it. So.
Thank you so much, Brian. This is so much information. And one of the things just I wanted to add that when people go to college, ultimately the end game is hopefully to get a job. And hopefully today's students are tomorrow's employers. So the diversity needs to be spread through students who are typical students, who might be the employer of somebody who's neurotypical. So
Absolutely.
They've got to start learning somewhere. So thank you on my end, personally, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Boyd. So we will be opening up for Q&A, so you can raise your hand and I can call on you and you can unmute yourself, or you can enter your question in the chat.
If someone asked about the slides, so I'm happy to send those. Priscilla, I guess I could send them to you and you can distribute them.
Absolutely.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that.
Perfect. Great. I think you stunned everyone with your amazing presentation. Everyone's quiet. Any questions?
Or like me and still needing coffee. It's a chilly day in Kansas City, Missouri.
Oh,
I'm assuming a lot of folks are likely professors or work at the college. Have you? I'm just curious from my perspective. Have you had autistic students in your class that you're aware of? For anyone?
I think one of the things that I often, when I've been on meetings where a professor will say that the student was behaving not in a typical way, and they didn't know what to do. And I said that might be maybe further conversation with our head of our accessibility office, but that seems to have come up on a couple of meetings that I was on.
Yeah.
So suggestions for what to do as a professor.
Yeah. Yeah.
You have any ideas on what they might, any suggestions for what they would do if they had a student who was not following the party line, or needed to get up and walk around, or whatever, interrupting?
Yeah, I mean, it probably is working with your office to figure out what sort of accommodations need to be put into place. I think it's again, I think it's another way which we are diverse in thinking about the appropriate supports and accommodations that can be put into place. Like some things can be dealt with, easy others, but understanding, recognizing signs in students who may need to get up and prompting them in advance, like it looks like you might need to take a break. It's okay if you want to take a break, giving them permission to take a break if needed, if they're feeling that way, to go walk outside so they're not disturbing the class and come back. So I think, I think for all of us, I'm a college professor as well. It's, what can the situation allow? But I think all of us try to be as supportive as we can of all students, but you can't accommodate everything. So what can be done? But these are smart students. Talking and asking them what would be helpful. Looks like you're having trouble in this area. What can we do? What are some things we can do to be helpful in this situation? Maybe to help you, you're interrupting, helping them recognize a problem, helping them sort of co-generate a solution to the issue. I don't think we should be afraid to talk to the students and ask them for their input as well. But certainly working with the accessibility office too, to officially get those things documented and into their plans is a really helpful step, and to help other students understand why a particular accommodation is being made for a student. So.
Perfect. I got a message asking if you had any recommendations for any like further reading or literature that you could direct us to increase our knowledge on
Yeah, I
this.
think a colleague of mine, Jan Blatcher at UC Riverside, I think they put together a documentary on autism in college that may be a helpful resource. I'll see if I can find a link to it. So it will be something more fun to watch than an academic paper. But I think it was about being autistic in college. That was a nice documentary. I think it may have been a documentary film that may even have won or been nominated for some kind of award. So I think it'll give you a better sense of their experiences. So I'll see if I can find the link for it, and I can send that to you, Priscilla.
Perfect. And just some comments of excellent presentation, and this is a needed training for faculty at the college. If there aren't any other questions, Dr. Boyd, thank you so much for your fantastic presentation. I know I learned a lot today, and I'm definitely going to be rewatching and reviewing those slides because it's just helpful information. So thank you so much for participating in our academic festival.
Yeah, enjoy the rest of it. And again, apologies for the technical issues, but they happen from time to time. But hopefully you got the bigger point.
Yeah.
And believe me, it's happened to all of us. I can promise you that.
They do happen. And I would just like to take a moment. I definitely want to turn it over to Hannah Mokoriki, who is the chair of the academic festival committee, just to kind of close us out.
Thank you so much. I really don't feel much of a chair. We had such a wonderful group going again. Priscilla, many, many thanks for all the things you're doing, including being the Fireside Chat partner of Alex Kotlowitz, of guiding us through the whole process. Ruby, who has written so much and looked over everything with great detail. Janie bringing in the wonderful speaker, Javan bringing in a wonderful speaker, everyone working together really well. And I really appreciate everyone who attended the events. Of course, thank you to our wonderful presentation today. I also feel that we have to learn so much more about this. My husband actually works in a company with 75% neurodiverse people. It's a really, really interesting experience. So I'm very, very happy if we get that conversation continued in multiple ways. So thank you for everybody, anyone from NCC, students, staff members, faculty, for coming and attending and for keeping our academic festival alive. I think we had a wonderful couple of events, and hopefully the last COVID academic festival for a little while. Hopefully next year we can be back on ground and see a lot of wonderful people here. So thank you to everybody. Hope I didn't forget anyone.
Thanks, Hannah.